July 14th, 1945, U.S. Naval Base, Guam. The truck gate scraped shut with a metallic groan, sealing them inside. Chio smelled the diesel fumes, sharp and heavy in the tropical humidity. She pulled Emmy closer, shielding the younger nurse's face as a tall Marine sergeant approached, clipboard in hand. Emmy was trembling, her hands raw from weeks of hiding. Chio saw the sign posted by the processing tent, the Japanese characters stark and freshly painted. Tat ka tu nan se joch joy shu nanjao. All prisoners will be treated humanely. The sergeant did not look at them, only at his list. He pointed. Line up, processing. Chio whispered to Emmy, Shh, Jung-hin. Don't look, just walk. This moment of profound transition was a story shared by thousands. We invite you to subscribe to hear more unspoken histories and share which country's story we should explore next. 2 weeks earlier, the caves of Okinawa. The air in the cave was thick enough to drink. It carried the smell of wet limestone, human waste, and something sweeter, more metallic, that Chio recognized with professional dread, the early stages of gangrene. She pressed her palm lightly against Emmy's forehead. The skin was dry, burning. The younger nurse whimpered, a thin sound that was swallowed instantly by the damp rock. Shh, Emmy-san, Chio whispered, her own throat raw. They will pass. Water, Emmy breathed. Just water. Soon. Chio knew it was a lie. The rain had stopped 2 days ago, and the muddy pool near the cave mouth, already fouled, had dried completely. Outside, the world had been reduced to 2 sounds, the distant, rhythmic crunch of American artillery and the immediate, terrifying crackle of boots on volcanic rock. The boots were closer today. They were the last 2 survivors of their field hospital unit. Everyone else was dead, or perhaps worse, captured. Chio's mind cycled through the images provided by the Imperial command pamphlets, the grinning, horned Oni, demons, with their bayonets, the dishonor, the torture. Death was not the enemy. Capture was. To be taken alive was a failure worse than death. Emmy's teeth began to chatter, a violent, rattling sound in the quiet dark. Chio grabbed the younger woman's shoulders, holding her still. You must be quiet, Emmy. They are right there. Chio crawled toward the sliver of gray light at the cave's entrance. She peered through a screen of damp ferns. 2 American soldiers stood 30 yards away, rifles held casually, pointing toward the next ridge. They were enormous, larger than any men she had ever seen. They laughed about something, the sound deep and alien. Chio tasted the grit on her teeth. In her pocket, she felt the small, damp cloth bag holding their last ration, salt. It was meant to replenish what their bodies lost to sweat and sickness. But for Chio, it served another purpose. Every morning, in a futile ritual of civilization, she wrapped a soiled rag around her finger, dipped it in the salt, and scrubbed her own gums, trying to erase the taste of decay. It was a harsh, stinging cleanliness that felt like a memory of home. Emmy coughed, a wet, racking sound that echoed terribly. The laughter outside stopped. Chio froze. The soldiers turned, their faces now sharp with alert. One of them shouted something. Chio scrambled back, pulling Emmy deeper into the blackness, her hand clamped over the younger nurse's mouth. Emmy struggled weakly. This is it, Chio thought. They will throw in fire, or gas. We die here. Instead, a new sound came, a metallic squawk, followed by a voice, amplified and distorted. It was speaking Japanese. The accent was terrible, barely recognizable. Anzen, safe. Come, out, Mizu, water. We have medicine, Anzen. It was a trap. It had to be. The pamphlets warned of this, of tricks used by the barbarians. The voice repeated itself. Come out. Medical care. No harm. Safe. Emmy had gone limp beneath her, her breathing shallow. The smell of gangrene was stronger now. Chio looked at the salt bag in her hand, then at Emmy's pale, cracked lips. Emmy would die in this cave. That was a certainty. She would die of fever and infection, in the dark, smelling of filth. The voice outside offered water. It offered medicine. It was undoubtedly a lie leading to torture and death. But it was a different death. Anzen, the voice repeated. Safe. Chio made her decision. She would not let Emmy die like this. She would risk the barbarian's lie for the chance of 1 cup of clean water. Chio supported Emmy's weight, a dead burden that sagged against her. She half-dragged, half-carried her toward the gray light. We are going out, Emmy-san. Stay with me. She pushed aside the curtain of wet ferns. The sunlight was a physical assault. It was blinding, a white-hot spear that lanced Chio's eyes after weeks of subterranean twilight. She squinted, raising a hand that did nothing to stop the glare. The world outside the cave was fractured, bright, and terrifyingly open. The shouting started immediately. Hands up! Hands up now! Drop it! The language was harsh, guttural. Chio did not understand the words, only the violence in them. The 2 enormous soldiers were now 10, fanned out, their rifles all pointing directly at the 2 women. This was the moment. The pamphlets had been clear. The Oni would take their pleasure in the act of execution. Chio squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Emmy's head against her chest, turning her own body to shield the younger nurse from the first bullets. She braced for the impact, the tearing of metal through flesh. She held her breath and waited. Nothing happened. A second wave of shouting, more insistent. Chio risked opening her eyes. One of the soldiers, the tall one, was gesturing frantically, motioning upward with his hands. They want our hands up, Chio whispered, her voice trembling. Slowly, painfully, Chio let go of Emmy and raised her own hands. Emmy, barely conscious, slumped to the ground, collapsing in a heap of soiled rags at Chio's feet. Chio flinched. This was a failure of respect, an invitation for a kick or a rifle butt. Get up, she willed silently. But Emmy did not move. The tall soldier barked an order. Another, younger soldier moved forward, his rifle still aimed at Chio's center mass. He kicked aside the small bundle of rags they carried, their only possessions, looking for the grenades they were rumored to carry. He shouted something, a question, and nudged Emmy's shoulder with his boot. Emmy moaned. The tall soldier said something sharp, and the younger man backed off. The tall one approached, his shadow falling over both women. He lowered his rifle slightly. He looked at Chio, then down at Emmy. His face was sunburned and grim, but his eyes were not the red, demonic slits of the propaganda posters. They were just blue and tired. He knelt, not violently, but with a grunt of exhaustion. He unhooked a metal canteen from his belt. Chio tensed. Was he going to pour it on them? Douse them in gasoline? He twisted the cap. The sound was a metallic squeak. He pushed the canteen toward Emmy's lips. Chio stared. Mizu, the soldier said. He knew the word. Water. Emmy, smelling the water, stirred. She turned her head, her cracked lips finding the metal edge. The soldier tilted it gently. Clean water, not mud, spilled into her mouth. She drank greedily, desperately. Chio watched, stunned into silence. The entire world she knew had been built on the certainty of their barbarism. But barbarians did not waste clean water on a dying enemy. They did not tilt the canteen gently. After a moment, the soldier stood. He signaled to his men. The tension broke. Another soldier came forward with rough bindings and tied Chio's hands in front of her. They were efficient, impersonal, and did not pull the bindings tight enough to cut. They lifted Emmy, who was now marginally more aware, and placed her on a stretcher. Chio was prodded toward a large olive-green truck. As she climbed in, she looked back. The tall soldier was already drinking from the same canteen he had just given Emmy. They were not killed. They were not beaten. They were given water. The brutality they had prepared for had not arrived, replaced by a confusing, terrifying efficiency. The beach was not sand. It was a sprawling depot of metal, noise, and frantic activity. Chiyo, her hands still bound in front of her, was prodded with hundreds of others, soldiers, civilians, old women, and children, up a wide metal ramp and into the cavernous, dark belly of a ship. The ramp clanged shut behind them, an echoing boom of finality. The hold smelled immediately of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of vomit. The floor beneath their feet was not still. It vibrated with the deep, powerful thrum of massive engines. Then the world tilted. The ship did not sail. It lurched. It climbed massive, invisible hills of water and then slid sickeningly down the other side. Song, seasickness, became a collective misery, a leveling force more effective than any guard. Chiyo fought against the nausea, her stomach clenching. Emmy was nearby, still on her stretcher, which 2 American sailors had carried aboard and set against a bulkhead. But Chiyo could not reach her. A rope line separated the walking prisoners from the wounded, and a guard stood watch, indifferent. This was the new stake. Not just death, but isolation. Chiyo's only goal became keeping Emmy's pale face in her line of sight. Hours blurred into a day, then 2. The guards passed buckets of water and hard biscuits, which most prisoners were too ill or too terrified to eat. The rumors that had haunted the caves returned with new vigor. This was the real journey to the execution grounds. Perhaps they were simply being taken far out to sea, where the ship's hold would be flooded. A mass burial without the mess of bullets. Chiyo clutched the hard fabric of her pocket. Inside, she could still feel the small, damp cloth bag of salt. It felt useless now, a relic, a bitter irony. She had used that salt to fight the taste of decay, only to be brought here to die, surrounded by the smell of sickness. On the second day, a hatch opened above, spilling yellow light down the metal stairs. A guard descended, followed by an American woman. She was unlike the soldiers. She wore a crisp, dark blue uniform with a white cap and carried a square medical satchel. She was a U.S. Navy nurse. Chiyo recognized the bearing instantly. The clinical detachment, the economy of movement. It was the look of a professional. The nurse moved through the hold, ignoring the groans of the seasick, checking only the stretcher cases. She stopped at Emmy. Chiyo tensed, rising to her knees, preparing to rush the guard if the woman harmed Emmy. The nurse paid Chiyo no attention. She knelt beside Emmy, her movements brisk. She checked Emmy's pulse. She produced a thermometer, wiped it with a clean alcohol swab, and placed it in Emmy's mouth. Chiyo watched, mesmerized by the smell of the alcohol, a scent she associated with life-saving procedure, not capture. The nurse read the thermometer, clicked her tongue, and opened her satchel. She prepared a syringe. Chiyo recognized the antibiotic vial, penicillin. It was liquid gold, rarer than ammunition. The nurse deftly administered the shot to the unconscious Emmy. Then she produced 2 white pills, pressed them past Emmy's lips, and followed with a small sip of water from her own canteen. She spoke, not to Chiyo, but to the patient, her voice slow and clear, as if Emmy could understand. "This will help the fever. You'll be all right." Chiyo understood none of the words, but she understood the action perfectly. You do not waste penicillin. You do not waste a trained nurse. You do not waste care on livestock intended for slaughter. The nurse stood, made a note on a clipboard, and ascended the stairs. Chiyo sank back onto her heels. The floor still vibrated. The air was still foul. But the certainty of execution had fractured. They were being kept alive. The question was no longer if they would die, but why they were being saved. The engines slowed. After hours of shuddering deceleration, they stopped. A deep grinding noise came from the front of the ship, and daylight, brighter than the hatch light, flooded the hold. They had arrived. The ride from the landing ship was short, hot, and jarring. Chio and Emmy were herded into the back of an open-air truck, the metal floor burning through the thin fabric of their clothing. The truck rumbled over gravel and packed mud, moving through a sprawling, orderly city of tents, prefabricated huts, and barbed wire. The vehicle lurched to a final stop in a large, open square. Out! Out! Chio helped Emmy slide off the tailgate. The younger nurse's legs buckled, the brief resurgence from the penicillin already fading. They were funneled by armed guards toward a wire fence and a wide gate. This was the moment the cold open had teased. The truck gate scraped shut behind the last woman, a metallic groan that sealed them inside the pen. Chio smelled the diesel fumes, sharp and heavy in the tropical humidity. She pulled Emmy closer, shielding the younger nurse's face as a tall Marine sergeant approached, a clipboard rattling in his hand. Emmy was trembling violently, her eyes wide with a terror Chio had not seen since the caves. "Line up! Single file! Processing!" the sergeant bellowed. His voice was pure aggression. Chio's gaze darted around, looking for the execution spot, the ditch. Instead, her eyes locked onto a piece of white wood nailed to the side of the main processing tent. It was not in English. She froze. The characters were stark, Japanese, and freshly painted. Subete no bulu wa rindodeki ni iksawareru. Tatchatun hanse joch joy shun hanjao. Chio read the words 3 times. Jindoteki ni. Humanely. The word felt absurd, a grotesque joke. It was a lie, certainly. A trick to ensure compliance before the real torment began. Barbarians did not paint signs promising humanity, but the confusion was paralyzing. This place was not a chaotic pit of slaughter. It was a factory. The gravel paths were raked. The tents were aligned in perfect rows. This was not impulsive brutality. It was cold, systemic, and utterly incomprehensible. The tall sergeant did not look at their faces. He did not look at Emmy's soiled bandages or Chio's matted hair. He only looked at his list. He pointed a thick finger. "Line up. Processing." Emmy whimpered as the line surged forward, shrinking from the sergeant's authoritative presence. Chio grabbed her arm, her voice low and fierce. "Shh, Jungnin. Don't look. Just walk." They were pushed toward a series of wooden tables under a canvas awning. At the first table, a Japanese-American soldier, a Nisei, sat with a typewriter. His face was impassive. "Namai." Name. Chio gave her name and Emmy's. The Nisei typed them onto a card. At the next table, a soldier gestured to their meager possessions. Everything. On the table. Most women had nothing. Chio reached into the torn pocket of her uniform. Her fingers closed around the small, damp cloth bag. It was the salt. The last item from Okinawa. The harsh substance she had used to scrub her gums, to remind herself she was civilized. She placed the dirty bag on the table. The soldier glanced at the lump of salt, his lip curling in brief disgust. He did not inspect it. He did not return it. He swept it casually off the table and into a metal waste bin. Chio felt a sharp, hollow pang. The last thread to her old life was gone, discarded as trash. They were handed a wooden tag on a string, stamped with a number. They were no longer Waita, nurses. They were numbers. The sergeant pointed them toward the entrance of the largest tent. "Next station, Delousing," the Nisei interpreter said flatly. "Remove all clothing, now." The tent flap dropped shut, enclosing them in a world of canvas, steam, and the sharp chemical smell of lye soap. Several American women in starched khaki trousers stood waiting. Their faces were scrubbed, businesslike, and revealed nothing. Chio recognized their efficiency. These were the waves, the female counterparts to the men outside. They held no weapons, only clipboards. All clothing off. Now, one of them commanded, her voice flat. She pointed to a large canvas bin. This was the final degradation. Chio's training as a nurse, accustomed to the human body in clinical settings, fought a losing battle against her identity as a Japanese woman. To be naked before them, the enemy, the victors, was a violation deeper than any weapon could inflict. She looked at Emmy, who stood paralyzed, clutching the collar of her filthy blouse, tears welling. The other women huddled together, a miserable herd, trying to shield one another. "Emmy-san," Chio said, her voice rougher than she intended. "We must. It is a procedure." It was a lie, she thought. It was a ritual of humiliation. Turning her back to the guards in a final, futile gesture of modesty, Chio forced her stiff fingers to work the buttons. The rotten fabric tore. The garments fell to the dirt floor, joining the pile. She stepped away from it, exposed, the humid air cold on her skin. She felt like livestock, stripped and ready for the dipping vats. The other women slowly followed, their movements pained. The waves were ruthlessly efficient. They moved the women forward, not with shoves, but with firm, impersonal gestures. First, the powder. An American woman wearing thick gloves held a metal canister with a hand pump. She aimed the nozzle at Chio's hair, under her arms, between her legs. A cloud of fine white powder, DDT, stung Chio's eyes and coated her skin. It smelled synthetic, sharp. Emmy coughed, choking, on the dust. Chio's expectations hardened. This was it. They were insects to be deloused. The sign outside promising humanity was a cruel joke. This impersonal chemical processing was the true face of the enemy. Next, showers. 5 minutes. They were nudged toward a concrete slab fitted with a dozen metal shower heads. Chio braced herself, grabbing Emmy's hand. She expected ice-cold water. She expected a brutal, high-pressure blast meant to sting and shock, the kind used to clean blood from a floor. One of the waves turned a large red valve wheel. The pipes shuddered. Water sputtered from the nearest showerhead, then hissed to life. Chio gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned. But it was not a burn. It was hot. It was not merely warm. It was truly, astonishingly, luxuriously hot. The water cascaded over her scalp, instantly washing away the stinging powder. It sluiced through her matted hair, dissolving months of mud, cave filth, dried blood, and the salt of the transport ship. The heat pounded her shoulders, her back, unlocking muscles that had been clenched in terror since Okinawa. For one suspended moment, Chio forgot she was a prisoner. She forgot the guards, the war, the humiliation. She simply stood, face upturned to the impossible gift. She heard a small sound and looked over. Emmy was leaning against the canvas wall, eyes closed, weeping silently as the grime ran in brown rivulets down her body. Hot water. In Japan, even before the worst of the bombings, hot water for bathing was a community privilege, a cherished ritual, rationed and requiring precious fuel. In the caves, water was a muddy, metallic sip from a helmet. This was not torture. This was not efficiency. This was comfort. A waft moved down the line, tossing each woman a small, rough bar of yellow soap. It smelled strongly of lye, but it lathered instantly in the hot water. Chio scrubbed her arms, her legs, her face, watching the layers of filth peel away, revealing skin she had not seen in months. Why? The confusion was a physical ache. Why waste precious fuel to heat water for your enemies? Why give soap to insects? Time's up. Out! Out! The valve squeaked. The water vanished. Chio shivered in the sudden absence of warmth, but the chill was different. It was the chill of clean skin, not the bone-deep cold of fever and filth. Steam rose from her shoulders. For the first time since she could remember, she did not smell decay, or salt, or fear. She smelled only the harsh, clean scent of lye. She felt human. They were herded from the concrete slab into a third section of the tent, their feet leaving wet prints on the canvas floor. The air here was dry, smelling of clean cotton and canvas. Piles of folded clothing lay stacked on wooden tables, sorted by size. A different waif, older, with weary lines around her eyes, stood by the stacks. She looked Chio up and down with a practiced glance, assessing her height and build. She pulled a set of light brown khaki, trousers, and a matching button-down shirt from a pile and tossed it to Chio. The fabric was stiff, abrasive, but indisputably clean. Chio caught it. It felt heavy, substantial. She dressed quickly, her damp skin resisting the rough material. The clothes were too large, the sleeves too long, the trousers baggy, but they were dry. They did not smell of salt or sickness. She helped Emmy, whose fingers were still clumsy, button the shirt. The younger nurse was shivering, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. The hot water and the penicillin were fighting a war on her behalf. Dressed in their new identities, uniforms not of soldiers, but of prisoners, they were lined up once more. The efficiency of the process was chilling. There was no conversation, no wasted motion. Chio felt they were components on an assembly line, being scrubbed, dried, clothed, and prepared for an unknown purpose. The humanity of the hot bath now felt like a contradiction, a confusing anomaly before the return to systemic indifference. The line moved toward the tent exit. A final double WAF officer stood near the flap, beside a large wooden crate. She was holding a small, tightly rolled canvas bag. As Chio approached, the officer, without making eye contact, pressed the small bundle into her hands. Chio stopped, confused. It was not heavy. It was soft. "Keep moving," the Nisei interpreter ordered from behind them. Chio shuffled forward, moving out of the processing tent and back into the humid daylight of Guam. The prisoners were being directed to sit in neat rows on the ground, awaiting assignment to their barracks. Chio found a spot and pulled Emmy down beside her. "What is it?" Emmy whispered, looking at the small bag in Chio's hands. Chio fumbled with the string tie. Her hands were still slightly swollen from the humidity. She pulled the knot loose and unrolled the canvas flap. Inside, nestled on the rough fabric, were 3 items. The first was another bar of soap, smaller than the one in the shower, smelling faintly of pine. The second was a simple, black, hard rubber comb. Chio touched it. She had not combed her hair in nearly a year. She had cut most of it off with a medical shear to combat the lice. The third item stopped her breathing. It was slender, perhaps 5 inches long, made of smooth, cream-colored plastic. At one end, embedded in the plastic, were neat, dense rows of white bristles. Alongside it lay a small metal tube, painted red and white. Chio picked it up. Her fingers, calloused and dirty, trembled as they closed around the smooth, manufactured handle. It was a toothbrush. It was not a communal stick. It was not a rag dipped in salt. It was a personal, brand-new, factory-made toothbrush. She looked at Emmy, whose eyes had grown wide. Emmy reached into her own kit and pulled out an identical one. In wartime Japan, such an item was an impossible luxury. Soap was rationed. Medicine was hoarded for the military. But a personal toothbrush, that was the domain of wealthy officials, of high-ranking officers. It was an item of profound, decadent, individual privilege. Chio looked around. Every woman emerging from the tent was holding one. every single prisoner. Emmy stared at the object in her hand, her face crumpling. A single choked sob escaped her, then another. She hunched over, hiding her face as she wept, her shoulders shaking, clutching the small piece of plastic as if it were a holy relic. Chio could only stare. The Japanese women around them were not shouting. They were not protesting. They were sitting in stunned, reverent silence. Or, like Emmy, they were simply crying. Chio ran her thumb across the stiff, white bristles. They were perfect, uniform, anchored in the smooth, cream-colored plastic. She thought of the cloth bag taken from her at the processing table, the gritty, gray salt that was its only contents. She thought of the harsh, stinging scrub against her gums every morning, a ritual that felt more like punishment than hygiene. The propaganda had been absolute. It was the bedrock of their world, the foundation of their resistance. The Americans were Kichiku, brute beasts, demons. They were rapacious, chaotic, and fundamentally inhuman. But demons did not do this. Barbarians did not care about the slow, invisible decay of dental enamel. They did not invest in the long-term, individual health of their captives. Torture, yes. Starvation, humiliation, ritualized violence. Chio had spent weeks preparing her mind for those certainties. She had not prepared for this. A toothbrush is not an instrument of war. It is not a tool of subjugation. It is a tool of maintenance. It implies a future. It implies an intention for the recipient to live, and not just to live, but to live with a measure of basic human dignity. Chio looked down at the object. It was cheap, clearly mass-produced, yet in her world it was treasure. Her father, a government administrator in Kobe, had not owned a personal brush like this since before the war began. Her mother used salt and cloth. The soldiers in her own field hospital. They were lucky if they had clean water to rinse their mouths. This small, white item represented a level of industrial wealth and a philosophy of care, so profound that it could be casually distributed, like ammunition, to the very enemies they were fighting. This was the turning point. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the medicine given to Emmy, which could be explained as a cold calculation to prevent the spread of disease. It was this useless, trivial, deeply personal object. They did not see her as livestock to be deloused and forgotten. They saw her as a person who needed to brush her teeth. Emmy's sobs next to her had quieted, replaced by the small, hitched breaths of someone utterly overwhelmed. Chio unscrewed the cap on the small, red and white metal tube. A sharp, sweet chemical smell rose from the opening. Haka, mint. It was the scent of peacetime, of expensive candies, of a world that no longer existed. A profound cold shame washed over Chio. It was a shame that eclipsed her nudity in the shower, a shame that rooted her to the spot. They had been taught to hate these people, to believe them incapable of humanity. And in response, these people had given her a luxury her own family, fighting for the emperor, could not dream of. This tiny gift was not an act of kindness. It felt like an indictment. That night, in the long, dark Quonset hut assigned to them, Chio lay awake. The barracks were filled with the soft sounds of women weeping, murmuring, or simply breathing in the unfamiliar quiet. She sat up. Emmy was asleep on the cot beside her. Chio took the new canteen of clean water they had been issued. She retrieved the toothbrush and the small tube. In the sliver of moonlight filtering through the screened window, she carefully squeezed a tiny bead of white paste onto the bristles. A single grain of rice. It felt wasteful to use any more. She brought the brush to her mouth. The flavor was a shock. Sweet, sharp, overwhelmingly clean. The bristles moved against her teeth, a gentle, scouring friction. It was not the biting sting of salt. It was not the fibrous pulp of a chewed stick. It was civilization. She rinsed and spat into the dirt floor beneath her cot. Her mouth felt alive, cool, and new. The feeling was so clean, so intensely personal, it felt like a betrayal. Weeks settled into a rhythm. Emmy's health returned, the penicillin in 3 daily meals, rice, pickled vegetables, and a salty canned meat they learned was Spam, bringing color back to her skin. The camp was run by an unwavering cadence. The morning whistle, the roll call, the meals, the lights out bugle. It was a monotony so organized, so free of random violence, it felt unsettlingly safe. Chio, identified as an experienced nurse during processing, was summoned by the Nisei interpreter one morning. She was assigned to the camp hospital, a series of long, cleaner Quonset huts, to assist the U.S. Navy nurses. The work was a relief. She was given a clean, white uniform, not the brown khaki of a prisoner. She was back among bandages, antiseptics, and the familiar cadence of medical care. Though her tasks were basic, changing linens, taking temperatures, sterilizing instruments, it restored a sense of purpose. The conflict did not come from the Americans. The WAVES nurses supervising her were strict, professional, but not cruel. They expected efficiency, and she provided it. The conflict came from Barracks B. In their hut, a group of women from Nagasaki, former munitions workers, held to the old ways. They still gathered nightly to bow toward the east. They refused to learn any English, and they watched. They saw Emmy, now healthy, trying to teach orphaned children the few English letters she had picked up. They saw Chio returning from the hospital, tired but with the focused look of a professional. One evening, Chio was at the communal spigot for her ritual, the one that now anchored her sanity. She was using her toothbrush, carefully rationing the mint paste. "Like an American," a voice said behind her. Chio turned. It was Otsune, the eldest of the Nagasaki group. Her arms were crossed, her face set in deep lines of contempt. "What did you say?" Chio asked, keeping her voice neutral. "That," Otsune nodded toward the toothbrush. "You use it every day. You wear their clean clothes. You work in their hospital. Have you forgotten who you are?" "I am a nurse," Chio said, her voice hardening. "Emmy was dying. They saved her. They saved her to make her a pet," Otsune hissed. "They give us soap and paste to wash away our Japanese spirit, and you scrub it away willingly." The older woman spat onto the gravel at Chio's feet. "Collaborator." Chio stood frozen, the toothbrush tight in her hand. The accusation was colder than the delousing shower. Isolation by the enemy was expected. Isolation by her own people was an agony she had not anticipated. Was she right to accept this humanity, or was she simply being domesticated? The doubt gnawed at her. At the hospital the next day, she worked mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The radio in the nurses' station was playing American swingu music, a fast, brassy sound that felt chaotic and frivolous to her ears. While cleaning the waiting area, she saw a paper on a table. It was a mimeographed newsletter, one side in English, the other in Japanese. It was for the prisoners. The Japanese headline read, "Your Rights Under the Geneva Convention." Her heart hammered. She had never heard of it. She quickly slipped the paper into the pocket of her white uniform. That night, long after lights out, Chio read the leaflet by the thin moonlight filtering through the barracks window. The document listed requirements. Housing must be adequate. Food must be sufficient. Medical care must be provided. Intellectual and recreational pursuits must be permitted. And, near the bottom, facilities for personal hygiene must be supplied. Chio let out a long, shaky breath. The toothbrush was not a gift. It was not a random act of kindness, nor a sophisticated psychological trick. It was law. It was policy. It was a bureaucratic provision for humanity, enforced with the same systemic efficiency as their ammunition logistics. The kindness she had experienced was not mercy. It was a procedure. To Chio, that realization was more shocking than the kindness itself. It was not personal. It was an ideology. The hospital was its own universe, governed by different laws than the camp. It smelled of carbolic acid, boiled linens, and a strange roasted scent Chio had never encountered before. Coffee. The Navy nurses drank it perpetually from thick white mugs. Her supervisor was Captain Miller, a tall, rangy woman with no patience for inefficiency. She did not smile, but she was not unkind. She simply expected the work to be done correctly. For weeks, Chio communicated in gestures and the few English words she was absorbing. Yes, no, clean, water. Her nursing skills, however, were a universal language. Captain Miller quickly saw that Chio was not just a laborer, she was a trained professional. Chio's hands were steady. She understood sterilization protocols instinctively, and she knew how to comfort a patient without words. Slowly, Miller began entrusting her with more than just bedpans. Chio was allowed to assist in dressing wounds. The conflict, Chio realized, was not between her and the captain. It was between her past and Miller's present. One afternoon, they were treating a prisoner who had badly gashed his leg on a piece of coral. Captain Miller had sutured the wound, and it was Chio's job to apply the final dressing. Chio worked quickly. She cleaned the area, applied the antiseptic, and took a sterile gauze pad from the tin. She covered the wound, but the gauze was slightly too large. She cut it, leaving a substantial scrap of clean, sterile material. Instinctively, Chio folded the clean scrap and placed it on the metal tray. It was perfectly good. It could be autoclaved again, or used for a smaller cut. To waste it was unthinkable. It was a habit born from years of making do, of washing and boiling rags until they disintegrated, of valuing a single clean thread like a jewel. Captain Miller, who had been writing on a chart, stopped. She looked at the tray. She looked at the folded piece of gauze. Then she looked at Chio. Chio tensed, expecting a reprimand. Perhaps she had broken a protocol. Miller pointed to the scrap. "What is this?" "Clean," Chio said, pointing to the gauze, then gesturing to the autoclave. "For next." Captain Miller stared at her for a long moment. The exhaustion on the captain's face softened into something Chio could not name. It was not pity. It was a profound, weary understanding. Miller picked up the folded gauze scrap. She did not raise her voice. She walked to the metal waste bin, the one with the foot pedal. She stepped on the pedal, the lid snapped open, and she dropped the gauze inside. It fell silently onto the pile of other used dressings. She turned back to Chio. She walked to the supply cabinet, opened it, and revealed a sight that still shocked Chio every day. Stacks upon stacks of sterile gauze tins, hundreds of rolls of bandages, dozens of bottles of alcohol. It was an arsenal of healing. Miller took down a new, full tin. She pressed it into Chio's hands. "We have enough," Captain Miller said, speaking slowly, enunciating every word. "Do not save. Use what you need. Always. We have enough." We have enough. The words hit Chio with the force of a physical blow. It was not just about the gauze. It was the penicillin for Emmy. It was the hot water. It was the endless supply of khaki uniforms. It was the toothbrush given to every single prisoner. This was their real power. Not the bombs, not the ships, not the endless ranks of tall Marines. It was this, the power of enough. The power to believe in abundance so completely that you could afford to be humane, not as a rare gift, but as a standard procedure. Chio felt a sudden dizzying wave of shame for Otsune and her misguided pride. Otsune believed they were fighting demons. Chio knew in that moment they were fighting a factory, and it had already won. She bowed her head to Captain Miller. "Hi," she whispered. "Yes." 2 days later, in August 1945, the camp sirens went off at an unscheduled time. But they were not sirens of alarm. The guards began shouting. Trucks drove through the compound, soldiers cheering, throwing candy to the children. The Nisei interpreter ran into the hospital, his face streaming with tears. "It's over," he shouted, first in English, then in Japanese. "The war is over. Senso wa owara. Japan has surrendered." The war ended, but their captivity did not. The mood in the camp, however, shifted overnight. The barbed wire, once a symbol of containment, now felt like a fragile membrane protecting them from the chaos of the outside world. The guards' postures relaxed. The swingu music from the radio no longer felt frivolous. It felt victorious. Otsune and the Nagasaki women fell silent, their rigid ideology shattered by the Emperor's broadcast. They were a ship without a rudder, adrift in a sea of cognitive dissonance. Chio, however, felt a strange, quiet resolve. Her world had also been shattered, but it had been rebuilt, piece by piece, starting with a bar of soap and a brush. Winter came, or what passed for it on Guam, a season of cooler winds and relentless driving rain. It was December 1945. Their names were finally called. Repatriation. They were being sent home. The news was met not with universal joy, but with a deep, trembling anxiety. Home? What was home? Chio had seen the reconnaissance photos the Americans had posted, pictures of Kobe, Tokyo, Hiroshima. There was nothing left. They were being returned from an orderly, well-fed sanitary camp to a wasteland of ash, starvation, and disease. Emmy, who was now working alongside Chio as a hospital orderly, voiced the fear. "Chio-san," she whispered one night, what if it is worse than the caves?" "It will not be," Chio said, with a confidence she did not fully feel. "We are different now." On their last day, they were given back a set of civilian clothes, donated, mismatched items from American charities, and a small canvas bag. Chio went to her cot to pack the few possessions she had acquired: a small dictionary she had been given by the Nisei interpreter, a bar of soap, and her white hospital uniform, which she had washed and folded. She reached under her thin mattress. Her fingers closed around the last item. She pulled it out and looked at it in the flat, gray light of the barracks. It was her toothbrush. It was no longer the pristine, manufactured object from the processing tent. The cream-colored plastic was scratched. The red and white paint on the toothpaste tube had flaked away. The bristles, once white and uniform, were now splayed, yellowed, and worn down on one side from months of daily, ritualistic use. It was no longer a luxury. It was simply hers. She thought of Otsune's accusation, collaborator. She thought of the stinging salt from the cave. She thought of Captain Miller's words. "We have enough." This worn object was the physical proof. It was the evidence that her entire world, the one built on emperor worship, on hatred of the Oni, on the nobility of dying, was wrong. It was evidence that humanity could exist not just as a fleeting personal emotion, but as a large-scale bureaucratic policy. She thought for a moment of throwing it away. It was a tool of the enemy. It was a reminder of her capture, her humiliation. But she could not. It was also the reminder of the hot water. It was the reminder of the penicillin. It was the anchor that had held her sanity. Chio carefully wrapped the worn toothbrush and the nearly empty tube of toothpaste in a small, clean rag, a scrap from an old uniform. She placed the bundle gently into the very bottom of her canvas bag. It was not a souvenir. It was her testimony. "Chio, Emmy, line up, ship number 3. The loudspeakers blared their new identities. Chio picked up her bag. She and Emmy walked out of the barracks, past the gate that no longer seemed menacing, and down the gravel path toward the harbor. The sea air was cold and sharp. She did not look back. She walked up the ramp of the LST, the same type of ship that had brought her here in terror. This time, her head was high. Her hands were untied. And in her bag, she carried the small, hard object that had taught her more about power than any bomb ever could.